The war between the United Kingdom and Russia has already begun. No, I'm not exaggerating, this is not a prediction. That's what the British intelligence chiefs themselves have been admitting publicly for months. The head of MI5, the service responsible for counterintelligence within the United Kingdom, said very clearly that Russia is committed to causing chaos and destruction on British streets. The then head of MI6, Richard Moore, head of the British equivalent of the CIA responsible for espionage outside the country, was even more direct. Russian intelligence, in his words, went crazy. And the head of the British Armed Forces admitted in an interview that the current situation is more dangerous than I've ever seen in my career. But this war is not the war you're imagining. It doesn't have as much crossing borders. It doesn't appear on the evening news. It's happening right under our noses in silence. And that's exactly why it's working. That's why, in April 2026, the United Kingdom did something no one thought they'd ever see happen again. After being shelved for more than 2 decades, London pulled out the British government's most classified document. A plan that, throughout the entire Cold War, contained the exact instructions on how to turn the whole country into a war machine in a matter of weeks. Its name is the Government War Book. And the fact that it's coming back now, at this very moment, is the official admission that London had been trying to hide at any cost. The age of peace is over. To grasp what's happening, you need to understand a concept that changed everything. Gray zone warfare. That's the technical name for a type of conflict that doesn't come through the front door. Instead of tanks and missiles, it uses industrial sabotage. Instead of a declaration of war, it uses drones invading the airspace. Instead of bombings, it uses cyber attacks against hospitals, factories burning in the middle of the night, and unexplained incidents in power grids. The goal, to cause harm without ever crossing the line that would justify a real military response. And it works. It works so well that Russia has turned this into its main weapon against Europe. And the numbers are frightening. According to data compiled by the risk consultancy Dragonfly, in 2025 alone, suspected Russian hybrid attacks in Europe had already surpassed by October the total of everything that happened in the entire year of 2024. In September 2025, the worst episode to date occurred. Swarms of Russian drones flew over Poland. Russian military planes violated the airspace of Estonia, Romania, Denmark, and Norway during the same period. It was the moment when NATO and Russia came closest to a direct confrontation since the Cold War. But, since none of these incidents, in isolation, was serious enough to justify a military response, Europe ended up just protesting. Now, if that's the rule throughout all of Europe, what's happening in the country that has most publicly opposed Putin since 2022? The most cinematic story of this new conflict begins on a Thursday, April 9th, 2026. The British Secretary of Defense, John Healey, calls an emergency press conference at Downing Street, the seat of the British government. He walks in wearing a dark suit and a subdued tie, and begins to speak with the controlled voice of someone who knows he's about to drop a bombshell.
I am revealing details of a recent military operation conducted by Russia. And by doing this, I do this to expose the ongoing Russian activity that threatens us in the United Kingdom and to highlight our constant readiness to respond.
Healey says that for more than a month, 3 Russian submarines were operating silently under the cold waters of the North Atlantic, north of the United Kingdom. One of them was an Akula, a nuclear attack submarine, one of the largest that Russia has. But, according to British intelligence, the Akula was just a decoy. The real target of the operation was the other 2. The other 2 were submarines from a Russian unit called GUDI, the main directorate for deep sea research. But the name is just a cover. In practice, these submarines have a single function, as Healy stated in simple words, to map underwater infrastructure in peacetime and sabotage it in conflict. Do you know what they were mapping? Cables. Submarine cables. Those fiber optic cables that run along the ocean floor, connecting the United Kingdom to the rest of the world, and through which, believe it or not, 99% of all international communication on the planet passes. Your WhatsApp conversations, your bank transactions, your video calls, all the content on the internet, everything. If those cables are cut, the United Kingdom not only loses access to the internet, it loses access to the global financial system, military communication, and the very functioning of the modern economy. The British operation to track the Russians was massive. There were 450 hours of patrol aircraft flights, thousands of nautical miles covered by a British frigate and Norwegian allies, and 500 British military personnel, involved day and night for weeks in conditions that Healy himself described as extremely challenging and treacherous. And when the Russians finally retreated, the minister made sure to send a public message. Direct, without beating around the bush. Looking at the cameras, he said, "To President Putin, I say, we see you. We see your activity on our cables and pipelines, and any attempt to damage them will not be tolerated and will have serious consequences." It's the kind of sentence that 5 years ago would have sounded like a movie script. Today, it's an official statement from the British government, but the Gyuzi submarines are just one of the weapons in this war. The other is their complete opposite in every way. It doesn't cost billions, doesn't require military training, doesn't need secret technology. And precisely because of that, it might be even more dangerous. In October 2025, a British judge sentenced a young man named Dylan Earle, who was 21 years old, to 17 years in prison. Earle was not a spy, had no military training, was not Russian. He was just a small-time drug dealer from central England who was dissatisfied with life. He was looking for, as he told a psychiatrist, a fresh start. He found this fresh start through an anonymous channel on Telegram called PrivatBot. This channel, controlled by operatives linked to the Wagner Group, the famous Russian mercenary militia, invited Europeans to join the resistance against Ukraine's allies. The contract was simple, a mission paid in cryptocurrency, no face, no name, no signature. Earle agreed. He received 5,000 euros in crypto. And in March 2024, he and an accomplice set fire to a warehouse in East London. The warehouse belonged to a Ukrainian couple who shipped Starlink terminals to soldiers in Ukraine. The damage exceeded £1 million. And here is the point that changes everything. Earle was not an isolated case. He was part of a pattern that Western intelligence calls the Uber of sabotage. Instead of training professional agents for years, Russia now simply outsources the dirty work. It recruits low-cost criminals through Telegram, pays them in crypto, and never shows up again. If the guy gets caught, Russia denies everything. If it works, no one can prove who ordered it. According to the British Institute for Strategic Studies, more than 50 acts of sabotage in Europe between 2022 and mid-2025 follow this same pattern. There were fires in shopping centers in Warsaw, bus fires in Prague, attacks on logistics centers spread across the continent. Everything was organized through messages on Telegram, carried out by local delinquents, and paid for in digital currency. But this is where the story gets really scary. Because this invisible war isn't just hitting anonymous warehouses in East London, it's reaching all the way to the top of the British government. According to a recent report from the Royal United Services Institute, the most respected defense research center in the United Kingdom, properties linked to Prime Minister Keir Starmer himself have been targeted by fires suspected to have Russian connections. Russian diplomats were caught trying to enter restricted areas of the British Parliament. and telegram channels with Russian ties were caught inciting Londoners to carry out violent attacks against mosques. An attempt, according to British intelligence, to set the country's social fabric on fire from the inside out. And when the United Kingdom tried to react, tried to show strength, to show that it would no longer accept this passively, the result was humiliating. On March 26, 2026, Prime Minister Keir Starmer made a pompous announcement. He declared that the Royal Navy from that day on was authorized to board and seize Russian oil tankers from the so-called Ghost Fleet. That network of more than 1,000 old ships without a defined flag, which Russia uses to sell oil while evading Western sanctions. It was an aggressive measure. It was a response. It was a message. And do you know what happened next? Nothing. Literally nothing. In the following weeks, several Russian oil tankers quietly crossed the English Channel. One of them passed by escorted by a Russian Navy frigate armed with anti-ship missiles. And do you know what the British Navy managed to send to accompany them? A simple auxiliary tanker, unarmed, with no offensive capability. A reporter from the Daily Telegraph who covered the scene had to rent a 12-meter fishing boat to be able to film, because there were no British military vessels available. The British Attorney General Lord Hermer warned that the operation could violate international maritime law. In other words, the United Kingdom authorized it publicly, but internally blocked everything. No Russian ship was seized. No cargo was confiscated. Nothing? But the worst part wasn't even the failed operation. The worst part was the reaction. The world started to laugh. Donald Trump, in an interview, called the British fleet toys. The American Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, openly mocked the great and powerful Royal Navy. And in London, British generals have begun to quietly admit what they had been trying to hide for years. The United Kingdom's army is now at its smallest size in the last 200 years. And the British Navy, which dominated the world's oceans for 3 centuries, today can't even secure its own channel. And this is where the problem lies. Because the United Kingdom has spent the last 30 years cutting defense, selling military equipment as scrap, closing bases, laying off soldiers. The British elite believed with almost religious conviction that peace was the final state of humanity. It was a calculation. And as you may have noticed, that was a miscalculation. And here we come to that war book we mentioned at the beginning. Because it was exactly in this context, submarines spying on cables, criminals being recruited through telegram, a prime minister with houses on fire, the Navy being humiliated, that the head of the British Armed Forces, Air Marshal Richard Knighton, finally made the announcement. At a defense conference in London in April 2026, he confirmed the war book is coming back. This document was created during the First World War and was constantly updated until the fall of the Soviet Union. It has 16 chapters and describes with obsessive precision how to transform the entire United Kingdom. Cities, factories, hospitals, communication systems, everything. From a peaceful civil society into a society in total war within 28 days. But the old Cold War version was written with only 2 threats in mind: Soviet invasion and nuclear war. But the new version, which is being written right now, needs to deal with an enemy that attacks in ways no one imagined in 1989. Undersea cables being cut, power grids being hacked, addicts being recruited through telegram, drones invading Europe's airspace, and disinformation spreading across social media like wildfire. Knighton summed up the turning point in a sentence that will make headlines for years. The British strategy is no longer defense, now it's resilience. And resilience, according to him, requires involving the whole society, not just the army. It looks good on paper, but there's a problem because involving the whole society requires resources. And the United Kingdom, after 30 years of cutting defense, is in a terrible position to start now. The numbers are brutal. To give you an idea, the British Army today has 70,000 full-time soldiers. It's the smallest size in over 200 years. The British Navy, as we've already seen, can barely patrol its own waters. And the defense budget, which is being increased in phases, will reach 3.5% of GDP by 2035. The biggest increase since the Cold War. But it will only really start coming into the coffers from 2027 onwards. And here we come to the question that gives British generals chills, the question that no one in London can ignore anymore. Will there be enough time? Will there be enough time to rebuild an army that was destroyed over 3 decades before the enemy decides to launch a real attack? The United Kingdom is behind. And, in the words of the head of the armed forces himself, Europe is now going to hurt. Maybe the real change isn't in the submarines or in the laws, but in people's minds. Throughout our whole lives, we grew up believing that peace was the natural state of things and war, well, that was the exception. Not anymore. In January 2026, the scientists from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists set the Doomsday clock to 85 seconds to midnight. It's the closest to the end that this clock has ever recorded in its entire history. Closer than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Closer than it has ever been. And what the United Kingdom is doing now is not the isolated reaction of a concerned European island. It's the sign of an entire civilization realizing that the comfortable era of peace is over. What comes next, no one knows. But the United Kingdom has finally woken up. I'd like to know your thoughts. Do you believe that this invisible war will turn into an open war between the United Kingdom and Russia in the coming years? Or will all of this continue in the gray zone as we see now? Comment below with what you think. If you like this video and want to keep understanding what's really happening behind the scenes around the world, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share. See you next time.